The morning I turned 42, I found a grocery bag on my porch with a birthday card inside and a check for $500. My brother's handwriting, no phone call, no explanation. Just his name on the signature line, like it was a tip he'd left for a waitress he'd never see again. I stood there in my robe in the October cold, and I did not cry. I want you to know that. I did not cry because I had learned a long time ago that tears are a gift you give to people who deserve to watch you break, and Robert had never deserved a single thing from me. What I did instead was walk back inside, set the check on my kitchen counter, and make myself a cup of coffee. I drank it slowly. I thought about my father standing in the barn doorway 30 years ago, his hands smelling like diesel and good dirt, telling me he had something put away for me, something nobody could take. I thought about how I had been 10 years old and had nodded like I understood, the way children nod when they love someone and want to seem older than they are. I had not understood, not yet. But what happened 3 weeks later proved that my father understood everything. My name is Patricia Ann Holloway. I was born in the spring to a woman I never met, placed in foster care before I had a name, and adopted by the Holloways of Clover Creek, Tennessee, before my second birthday. My father, James Earl Holloway, drove a tractor and repaired farm equipment for other people's fields, and never once made me feel like I had been borrowed instead of chosen. My mother, Ruth, canned vegetables from the garden every August and sewed my name into every piece of clothing I owned, because she said a girl should always know what belongs to her. Robert was 7 when I came home. He remembered the before. He remembered being an only child and the center of everything. And even though he was always polite in front of our parents, there was something in the way he kept track of things. Which piece of pie was bigger? Who got the window seat on the long drive to church? Whether our father ruffled my hair more than his on any given Tuesday? I did not understand that I was being watched and cataloged until I was much older. By then, the accounting had been going on for 20 years. I grew up in that farmhouse. I did my homework at the long kitchen table. I learned to drive on the gravel road between the hayfield and the pond. I left for nursing school at 22 with a suitcase and a thermos my mother had filled with coffee for the road. I came back for summers and holidays, and every time one of my parents needed a doctor's appointment, because Robert's wife, Linda, was always busy with something that couldn't wait. When my father got sick the second time, I was the one who rearranged my schedule. I was working as a charge nurse in Knoxville by then, 12 years into a career I had built on overnight shifts and borrowed confidence. I requested a leave of absence and came home. I set up his medications on the kitchen windowsill. I drove him to dialysis 3 mornings a week. I slept in my childhood room with the door open so I could hear if he needed anything in the night. Robert came at Thanksgiving that year. He walked through the house the way a man walks through property he is already arranging in his head. I noticed. I said nothing. I had learned to be very quiet when I was watching. My father died in February, a gray Tuesday with ice on the roads. I held his hand in the hospital room while the machines counted down what was left. Robert arrived 40 minutes after it was over, Linda behind him in a coat I recognized as new. He shook the doctor's hand. He thanked the nurses. He stood at the bedside and looked at my father's face and said, "Well, I guess that's that." And I understood then that some people grieve and some people calculate, and the calculating ones sometimes look exactly the same from the outside. My mother lived for 14 more months. They were hard months, the kind that people do not talk about honestly, because the truth of watching a parent slowly leave is too slow and too intimate for polite conversation. I came home every weekend. I cooked. I organized her prescriptions. I drove her to church on the good Sundays and sat with her on the bad ones. Robert called on Sundays. Sometimes he called. He was busy with the business he'd started with Linda, a property management company that had grown into something that impressed people at dinner parties. My mother died on a Thursday in April. She went quietly, the way she had always done most things. I was there. Robert was not. The family meeting happened 2 weeks later, in the kitchen where I had grown up. Robert sat at the head of the table. Linda sat beside him with a yellow legal pad. I was offered the seat near the window, the one a little apart from theirs, and I understood the geometry of it, but I sat down anyway because I had nothing to hide and nowhere else to be. Robert said he'd been handling the estate since it was simpler that way. He said our parents had updated their documents when Dad first got sick. He slid a single page across the table, The way you give someone a permission slip you've already decided they don't need to sign. The farmhouse, the land, the savings accounts, all transferred to Robert James Holloway as sole heir. I read the page twice. Then I looked up. I asked where my name was. Linda clicked her pen. Robert looked at his hands. He said our parents had wanted things to be simple, that maintaining the farm required someone with real investment in it, that it was a business decision more than anything personal. I asked again, where was my name? Robert said, not unkindly, the way someone delivers news they have practiced, that legally speaking, they had wanted the family property to stay in the family bloodline. He used those words, family bloodline. In the kitchen with the same blue curtains my mother had sewn 30 years ago. I did not explode. I want you to understand that. Explosions give people something to point to. I sat very still, and I asked if I could have a copy of the documents. Robert said the originals were with the estate attorney. Linda said I was welcome to reach out to him directly. The subtext was clear. They knew I did not have the money for that kind of fight, and they had already done the arithmetic. Then Robert reached into a folder and slid a white envelope across the table. He said our mother had wanted me to have something. A gesture. His word. Gesture. I opened it. Inside was a check for $500 and a small note in Linda's handwriting that said, "With love, the Holloways. With love, the Holloways." As if I had ever been anything else. I folded the envelope. I thanked them for their time, which I think startled them. I walked out through the kitchen where I had done my homework, past the barn where my father had once told me I would always have a place to stand, and I drove back to Knoxville in the dark. I did not cash the check. I put it in the back of my kitchen drawer where it sat for 3 weeks like a question I wasn't ready to answer. The first winter after my mother died was the kind of winter that gets into your bones and doesn't leave. I picked up extra shifts because work was the one place where my value was not subject to anyone's opinion. I was good at my job. I had been good at it for 15 years. I knew which patients needed the light left on and which ones needed the room quiet and which doctors would listen if you told them something felt wrong. My coworker, Daphne, who had the kind of laugh that reorganized a room, noticed I was eating lunch alone more than usual. She didn't make it a thing. She just started sitting down. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. I tried once to look into the estate documents myself. I called the county clerk's office and asked about property records. The farmhouse had already transferred. The transfer had been filed in January, before my mother had even died, which meant Robert had been in motion while I was still driving home on weekends to cook soup and sit in church pews. I held that piece of information carefully, the way you hold a sharp thing, and I thought about whether it meant what I thought it meant. I could not afford to be wrong. So I waited. I did not have a plan. I want to be honest about that because stories about quiet women getting justice sometimes make it sound like there was a chess game being played from the start. There wasn't. I was just a nurse who went to work and paid her rent and missed her parents and tried not to think about the blue curtains in a kitchen that didn't belong to her anymore. What I had was a memory. My father, the barn doorway, diesel, and good dirt. Something nobody can take. I had half understood it as a child's comfort. The kind of thing good fathers say. I had not known he was being literal. I would not know for 3 more weeks. The envelope came on a Tuesday. Not a bill and not a card. A letter from a bank I recognized. The small branch on Main Street in Clover Creek where my parents had kept their accounts for 4 decades. It was addressed to Patricia Ann Holloway, not the Holloway estate, not Robert, not Linda. Just me at my Knoxville address. Inside was a single piece of paper. It said, in formal bank language, that a payable on death trust account opened in my name had reached maturity and required in-person verification to access. It listed a branch address and a contact name, Mr. Gerald Pratt, Senior Accounts Manager. I read it twice. I sat down. I thought about my father's hands on the steering wheel on those early morning drives to dialysis, how he had sometimes gone quiet in a way that felt like he was working something out. I thought about a conversation we'd had near the end, when his words came slower, when he had looked at me and said, "Patty, I want you to know I did what I could. Not everything, but what I could." I had thought he meant the driving and the medication and the nights I had slept with my door open. I had been wrong about what he meant. I did not call the bank. I did not call Robert. I did not tell anyone. I got up the next morning, put on real clothes, drove 2 hours back to Clover Creek, and I walked into that branch on Main Street. The lobby smelled like old carpet and forced air heat. There were 2 tellers and a plant in the corner that had been there so long it looked like furniture. A man in his 60s came out from a back office when the teller whispered my name. Gerald Pratt had the kind of face you trust immediately, not because it was handsome, but because it had been somewhere and come back honest. He shook my hand and asked me to come to his office. He closed the door. He looked at the letter I had brought, and then he looked at me the way you look at someone you've been thinking about. He said he had managed my father's accounts for 23 years. He said my father had come in alone, about a year before he died, and had asked Gerald to help him set something up. Gerald said my father had been very specific about how it should work. Gerald said, and I will never forget the careful way he said it, that my father had told him he wasn't sure he could protect me through the will, but he knew one thing he could protect me through. He turned the monitor toward me. I was not prepared for the number. I don't mean it was extraordinary by some people's standards. I mean that it was the number of a man who drove a tractor and repaired equipment and put away $20 at a time for 30 years because he had decided that one of his children needed a door that no one else could open. It was careful money, patient money. It had been added to over time, deposits made every year since I was a toddler, plus a life insurance policy my father had quietly changed the beneficiary on when my mother got sick. He had not changed it to the estate. He had changed it to me. Gerald explained it the way a man explains something to someone in shock. Slowly, in plain language, with pauses built in. A payable on death account does not pass through a will. It is not part of the estate. It cannot be reached by probate, by a deed transfer, or by a legal document signed in a kitchen in January while someone was still driving home on weekends to make soup. It was mine the day my father named me. Robert had filed every piece of paperwork in the state of Tennessee, and it had not touched a single dollar of it. I asked Gerald if Robert could have known about it. Gerald said the account was structured so that only the named beneficiary could access it, in person, with identification. It did not appear on any joint statement. It would not have shown on a quick audit of my parents' finances by anyone who wasn't looking specifically for it. Robert had taken the house and the land and the savings accounts. He had gone through every drawer and every folder. He had walked through the rooms with his arithmetic already done, and the whole time, the most substantial thing my father owned had been sitting locked behind a door that only had one key, and that key had my name on it. I looked out the window at Main Street. A man was walking a dog past the hardware store that had been there since I was a girl. The ordinary world, going about its ordinary Tuesday, not knowing that my father had just reached 20 years forward and put his hand on my shoulder. I dried my face with the back of my hand. I asked Gerald what I needed to do. He said I already had. I had walked in. Small towns are not good at keeping things quiet. I had signed the paperwork and driven halfway back to Knoxville when my phone rang with a number I recognized as Linda's. I let it ring. Then it rang again. Then it was Robert. I pulled off at a rest stop. I called Robert back because I had decided this would go my way in terms of venue and time, and a phone call was still on my terms. He didn't start with hello. He said he'd heard I had been at the bank. He said he thought we should sit down as a family and talk about what Mom and Dad would have wanted. He said whatever there was, it should be handled between the two of them and me, quietly, before any lawyers got involved. He used the word family 4 times in 90 seconds, which is 4 more times than he had used it in the 2 years I spent driving their mother to church while he managed properties in Nashville. I said I would be happy to talk. I told him I had one meeting I needed to finish at the bank first, a formality, and suggested the following Friday when Gerald would be available to answer any questions about how the account was structured. I suggested we meet there, at the bank. I said it would be simpler that way. His words. His word back in that kitchen. Simpler. He agreed before he understood what he'd agreed to. I spent that week working. I picked up an extra shift on Wednesday because the unit was short-staffed and because I have never in 15 years let personal business follow me into a patient's room. I bought a blazer I had been putting off buying. I called Daphne on Thursday night and I told her the broad outline of it. And she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Patty, go walk in there and be every inch of who you are." I wrote that down. I still have it. Friday morning, I drove back to Clover Creek for the 3rd time in a month. I parked in the same spot. I walked into the same lobby. They were already there, Robert in a sport coat that looked freshly pressed, Linda with the yellow legal pad, and at the edge of the lobby, sitting in one of the chairs near the door like she wasn't sure she was allowed to be there, was my mother's oldest friend, Vera, who Robert had apparently brought as some kind of character witness or moral ballast. Vera had known me since I was 2 years old. She had held my hand at my mother's graveside. I couldn't quite tell if she understood what she'd been brought into. Robert started before Gerald came out. He said he had spoken to an attorney. He said payable on death accounts were sometimes challengeable when there was evidence of undue influence. He used that phrase carefully, the way someone uses a phrase they have recently learned. Linda had the legal pad open. I let him finish. Then I said, very quietly, that I would like Gerald to join us, if that was all right. Gerald came out from the back in the same suit he'd worn on Tuesday. He shook everyone's hand. He had a folder under his arm. He stood at the small table in the lobby corner where Robert had arranged us like a meeting, and he explained, in the plain language he had used with me, what the account was, how it had been structured, when it had been opened, and what my father had said when he opened it. That last part stopped Robert mid-sentence. He had been starting to say something about intent and family understanding and what their parents would have wanted. Gerald said, in the steady way of a man who keeps records, that he had notes from the original meeting, that James Earl Holloway had told him he wanted his younger daughter, he called me his younger daughter, to have something that could not be moved or managed or persuaded away from her by anyone. Gerald said my father had been specific about the reason. He said my father had told him, and Gerald read from his notes, that some people count everything, and some people give everything away, and he wanted to make sure the one who gives gets something nobody can argue about. The lobby was very quiet. Linda put her pen down. Robert's face did something complicated. He looked like a man who had been certain he was standing on solid ground and had just felt it move. He said after a long moment that he hadn't known. And I believe him, actually. I believe Robert had genuinely not known. He had walked through the house and the barn and the accounts and had not found it because it was not there to find unless you were me, standing in this building with my ID and my father's instructions. He had taken everything he could see. He had simply not been able to see everything. What he said next is the part I will carry with me. He looked at me across the table, Robert, who had stood in our parents' kitchen and talked about family bloodlines, and he said, "You should have said something. You should have told me." I thought about that for a moment. I thought about the envelope with $500 and Linda's handwriting. I thought about the word gesture. I thought about my father's kitchen table and the geometry of where I had been asked to sit. I said very quietly, so only he could hear it, "You should have asked." Vera, who had been sitting near the door this whole time, stood up then. She crossed the lobby and stopped in front of me, and she did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Your mama knew who you were. She always did." She squeezed my hand. She walked out without looking at Robert. Some witnesses, it turns out, do not witness what they were brought to witness. They witness what is true. I did not buy the farm back. People ask me this, and I understand why. It would be the neat ending, the symmetry of it. But I am a practical woman, and I am a nurse, and I have learned that healing and revenge are not the same thing, and only one of them does any lasting good. What I did was this. I kept my apartment in Knoxville for another year because I had earned that apartment, and I was not going to let an inheritance tell me who I was. I set aside a portion for a fund I named the James and Ruth Holloway Fund at the County Library System, a small scholarship for foster and adopted children in Clover Creek and the surrounding county, for books and fees and the small costs of early education that most people do not think about because they have never had to. My father saved $20 at a time. The least I could do was spend some of it on children who needed to know someone had saved for them. I also quietly set up an account for my niece, Danny, Robert's daughter, who is 11 and has my mother's eyes and a laugh that fills a room. I set it up in her name only, payable to her alone, in-person access, no exceptions. Danny does not know about it. She won't know until she needs it. But when the day comes, if it comes, when someone decides she doesn't quite fit in the room she was born into, there will be a door waiting for her with her name on it. Robert and I do not speak often. I will not pretend otherwise because false reconciliation is its own kind of lie, and I have had enough of those. We exchange pleasantries at the rare occasion that calls for it. He is not a villain in the movie version of this story. He is a man who counted when he should have shared and made choices that could not be unmade. The consequences have been quiet, the way real consequences usually are. He knows what he did. I know he knows. That is enough. As for me, I still work the cardiac unit. I still eat lunch with Daphne on Thursdays. I grew tomatoes on my balcony last summer, and they were not as good as my mother's, but they were mine, and that matters more than it might seem. There is a thing I say to the young nurses when they come to me with their shaking hands and their hard questions. I tell them that the patients who worry me are never the ones who say they're in pain. The ones who worry me are the ones who go very quiet. Quiet is not the same as okay. Quiet is sometimes just a person who has decided to save their energy for what matters. My father was quiet his whole life. He drove a tractor. He repaired other people's equipment. He put $20 away at a time for 30 years, and he never once mentioned it because he was saving his energy for what mattered. And what mattered was making sure I had a place to stand that no one's name but mine could unlock. I did not know that story while he was alive. I know it now, and I carry it with me into every room where someone has decided I don't quite belong, because my father taught me, from a distance of 20 years and a grave, that belonging is not something a family meeting can give you or take away. You were either chosen on purpose or you weren't. I was. He built me a door to prove it. And the day I walked in, I found out that the people who tried to count me out had spent years spending down everything they could reach, while the thing that could not be reached sat quietly waiting, the way good things do, for the person it had always been meant for. Take the check out of the drawer, drive to the bank, walk in. You were always on the list. Some fathers just write it somewhere no one else can read. Thank you for watching. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment below. Tell me about something you held on to that you couldn't explain, something that turned out to matter. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're new here, welcome to Quiet Strength Stories. Subscribe and stay close. The quiet ones always have the most to say.